Good morning, everyone. We are still admitting participants, but as my clock hits 9 o'clock, we would want to ever so slowly get going, recognizing that some will probably be dialing in the coming minutes. My name is Christian Singleson. I'm the director of ACER, and I want to welcome you to this webinar, which is a walkthrough presentation of the report that we delivered on Friday, that which we call our final assessment of the EU electricity market design. I will go through briefly the agenda and a little bit sort of the final terms before handing the floor to the three subsequent substantive sessions that we have in mind. Maybe Maria, we can click one and just very briefly present the agenda that we have in store for the next 90 minutes. Some of you may know that we had originally foreseen a 60-minute webinar. We did get very many registrations for participants, and because we want to have an option also for some Q&A, we have extended it with an additional 30 minutes. So instead of closing at 10, we are closing at 10:30. I need to mention that we will be video recording this particular webinar. We will make a link available on our website early next week, and the same goes for the slides. We'll make those available at the same time as the link. We have three sessions in store for you. First one focuses on wholesale electricity market, both the current design, how it works, its benefits, and ways to improve it going forward. We'll also touch in this session briefly upon some of the more near-term intervention type measures which are currently being debated. We have a second session which focuses more on gas markets as they impact electricity markets, as well as on the retail side and consumer protection issues as such. And we'll close with a summary of the 13 measures that we have put forward for policymakers' consideration, and we'll ask Katarina Siko-Magni, director at DG ACER, for some very initial reactions on the part of the European Commission. After each session, we'll have a brief Q&A via the Slido system, which my colleague Francois Baud will go through in a second. Maybe if we click one, Maria, I can just briefly mention the context for the report. You will know, many of you, we were mandated with this task in the so-called toolbox communication of the European Commission back in 13 October. And the mandate for us was to look at the benefits and drawbacks of the existing electricity wholesale market design and put forward recommendations to the Commission by April. And that was the report that we issued on Friday. In the same toolbox communication, we were also asked to come with a so-called preliminary assessment by mid-November. This is the report, or the cover page that you see here on the right. And I mention it because in our April report, we do reference this preliminary assessment on a number of occasions. It is, of course, available on our website, so you can easily access that. Now, there's a couple of distinctions that flow from this particular mandate, which I want to mention. And the first one is that it's somewhat limited as to how much we cover gas markets in our report. We were tasked to look at the electricity wholesale market design. So we do make reference to it. We do have a brief chapter on it, but it's mostly in the context of the outlook for gas markets that we look at this, as this outlook is also relevant for electricity market functioning and pricing going forward. And the second distinction I wanted to mention here, Maria, we can actually click, I think, to the next page, is perhaps more politically acute, as it were, and it revolves around the very near-term emergency situation which the EU is faced with versus the somewhat longer-term perspective, the 10-15-year perspective of wholesale electricity market design that we are applying in our report. And if we sort of translate that distinction, if you will, into the latest European Council conclusions of end March, we can click one more, Maria. So whilst we do tackle in a broader, somewhat more general manner, certain interventionist options which are currently being discussed in Europe, the main focus, as it were, we can click one more, Maria, is this, shall we say, decade-long plus perspective of the functioning of the wholesale electricity market, obviously a key component in delivering upon the broader energy challenges of Europe, whether they are energy independence or decarbonization at scale, etc. The third distinction I wanted to make here at the outset, and we can click one more, Maria, is that we certainly also acknowledge in our report that whilst the report, in our view, tackles some very key issues, it is by no means sort of the full story of how electricity systems will evolve in Europe in the years ahead. There are several evolutionary trends which we do not really cover in the report, or we touch upon, but in a somewhat peripheral type manner, such as the implications of enhanced energy system integration, how to apply energy efficiency first principles, for example, for system planning, and this broader balance of what will be more the role of localized solutions and markets vis-a-vis more centralized solutions and markets. So we touch upon it here and there, but it's not the main thrust of the report. We'll be the first to acknowledge that it's not the full story, as it were. That's what I wanted to say in terms of broader background context and some of the distinctions here at the outset. I think I'll turn now to my colleague, Francois Baud, whom I'll briefly introduce now because you see him for the first time. Francois Baud is the project leader for this project team that we have put in place in ACER. Francois also leads our electricity security of supply team and is a multifaceted individual. And for that, will also take us through how we pose questions before you start moderating the first session. So I pass the floor to you, Francois.
Good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And welcome everyone to this webinar. As you can see, we have a number of participants. So due to technical limitation, at some point, some of you may only be able to attend as view only through Microsoft Teams. I will give you some practical guidance to ensure we can have some interactivity during this workshop. And first, I'd like to highlight that you should not, please, use Microsoft Teams chat. So do not use Microsoft Teams chat. If you would like to ask questions, please use Slido. You can access Slido through a number of technologies. You can access it on your smartphone through web browser. You can just also scan the QR code that you can see at the corner of the slide. Slido will ask you to enter your name. Please also include your affiliation so that we know who is asking question. Also, on top of asking questions, you may vote for questions so that then the most popular questions may be more likely to be answered during this webinar because we may have a number of questions. Another element related to technical issues. In case we face technical issues during this webinar, please do not send us an email. We will send you an email with how to access a backup telco channel if needed, if we face technical issues this morning. And as Kristen mentioned, and I'll remind you of that, this workshop will be recorded, so please keep that in mind. And with that, I suggest we move on and we start the first session. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The first session will discuss the wholesale electricity market design, the assessment of the current design, but also a discussion on how to future-proof it going forward and which measures to consider. I will first hand over to Rafael Moraes Garcia, who leads our market monitoring team for electricity, and then I'll hand over to Patrick Likes, who works on market integrity and transparency within ACER. So Rafa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francois. I will ask you if you can hear me well?
Yes, fine.
Perfect. Thank you. So good morning to everyone once again. My name is Rafael Moraes, and I'm, as Francois said, the team leader of electricity market monitoring. For this first part of the first session, I will be mainly talking about the current market design, and then will be my colleague, Patrick, who would be talking more about potential improvements to market design. So maybe we can move already to next slide. As we did back in our preliminary assessment back in November, I'll start by providing the context in terms of the price increase. We think that it's clear that when we are talking about the energy crisis, we have to talk first about gas prices. And this is what the figure in the slide shows. And it shows, in our view, three different phases. Why is this distinction in phases that for those that have already read the report, important in our view? In our view, it is relevant because in the first two phases that lasted until early 2022, gas prices, in our view, were to a large extent responding to physical signals, physical realities. namely the availability of imports through pipelines, but also to how attractive the EU prices, the market in the EU, was for the LNG cargoes, which led to prices going up and down several times during these phases. But still, to some extent, or to a large extent, explained by physical realities, at least how we understand it. However, in the third phase, displayed in this picture since February 2022, since the invasion of Ukraine, price developments seem less driven by physical shortages or by physical realities, and more are led by the extreme uncertainty in the near term. Once again, this is important also to explain and to try to understand the exceptional situation we are living, and also to largely explain the exceptional measures that we have seen across the EU. I would suggest now we move to next slide. And well, connecting with what we saw before, because of the price situation, the perception, well, also the reality is that the European energy markets are facing two issues, among possibly others, but two main ones at the moment. On the one hand, we have high energy prices, and at the same time, we have high price volatility. While it is difficult to predict how long the high price situation is going to last, even though one could do prognosis, but it's still with a high level of uncertainty, we believe that increasing levels of volatility are here to stay for one or for another reason, be it the increasing penetration of renewables, be it the uncertainty about technology. So it's something that we will see more and more, maybe not as exacerbated as today, but we definitely will see it continue to be seen in the years to come. To understand how our assessment, our report looks at the issue of volatility, we believe it's worth to refer to divergent views that have been expressed in recent months, and I'm sure all the audience have heard about that. When it comes to explain the reasons, some said that this is an indication that markets do not work, while others say that markets are working as expected. When it comes to actions, some say, well, volatility needs to be eliminated, needs to be avoided by changing the market design, including perhaps changing the pricing rules, while others understand that volatility needs to be managed through, as much as possible, the market, as it is today, potentially with some improvements. So what are our main messages that you will see or you saw in the report? Well, first, we understand that we need to preserve price signals. So modern resources tomorrow, we need good price signals today. Second, that market integration is part of the solution. And to illustrate how market integration is part of the solution, you see a figure on the right that was produced based on a simulation kindly conducted by NEMOs. NEMOs are the denominated market operators. And the figure displays the price dispersion in two scenarios. One scenario with the current market integration, the current market design, and another hypothetical scenario assuming no cross-border trade at all with isolated markets. All this for 2021. The larger orange bars that you see displayed there represent how huge price volatility could be if markets were isolated. Of course, this is based on an extreme scenario of isolated markets that we hope we will never see, but it recalls, at least to us, the importance of market integration. Then two other topics in our report are the need to improve the functioning of forward markets. This will be taken by my colleague Patrick in the next slides. And also, of course, and with a key priority, consumer protection that must remain. And there is a dedicated slides in session 2 for that. We can now move to next slide. So the figure displayed in this slide is based on the same simulations that we mentioned in the slide before, by comparing the current level of market integration with completely isolated, no cross-border trade at all. And this would mean, or this would render benefits, comparing one situation with the other, of around 34 billion euros for 2021. There are, as we already received some questions on these figures, there are two important remarks about these figures. The first one is that these benefits represent essentially the value of cross-border trade, and is different from the benefits of day-ahead market coupling as such, which nevertheless, it's also relevant and amounts to more than 1 billion per year. The second caveat is we have to admit that these benefits do not take away the high price situation, but it reminds to us, and I think that to many, that the problem is not solved by slowing down or throwing away the progress of market integration. By contrast, we believe that market integration is part of the solution rather than a part of the problem in this occasion. So if we move to next slide, we can see that market integration does not only deliver gains in terms of efficiency, but also security of supply. Here the figure shows in orange the evolution of imports in Belgium between 2017 and 19. And overall, the figure shows that towards the end of 2018, when there was a severe situation of nuclear outages, the level of imports raised to levels that were not seen before. And this was not only because of market coupling or market design, but it was also because of the coordinated actions taken by TSOs at that point in time. And it illustrates that whenever there is coordination and willingness, market integration, in our view, can deliver a lot. Similar, although not displayed here, a similar situation was observed in France with similar good outcomes towards the end of last year. Maybe to finalize, if we move to next slide, we should say that a lot has been done in terms of market integration. And everyone knows that a flagship project of market integration has been market coupling that is now completed or almost completed. And we have talked before about the benefits that integration and market coupling delivers, but we believe that market integration can deliver much more. And this is why among the first recommendations that you see in our report, we advise to speed up market integration or implementing what was agreed, which probably includes additional commitment that would be necessary to finalize some of the projects that have been delayed. This includes the flow-based market projects in Central Europe, in the Nordic area, integration of balancing market that is currently ongoing with a lot of work, implementation of European intraday auctions, and maybe last but not least, the meeting the so-called 70% capacity target that, in our view, is crucial to maximize cross-border competition. That would be all from my side on current market design. I will leave now the floor to Patrick Leix. He will take over for possible improvements in market design. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafa. And so moving on with the next slide, and this is on long-term markets and investment signals, how they can move to this best use of the market design that we have. So to get the most out of what we have, and long-term markets play a role in this because they're also the system that you will use to do your risk management and to do your hedging. So that's why these long-term markets are important. But we do recognize in the report there's some limitations to it. These limitations are linked to the limited liquidity in the market in some countries, but especially after a certain amount of time. So beyond 3 years, we see the liquidity in many European countries dropping significantly. We also address this in the next slide, please. So we also address how we can better future-proof such long-term markets. And the two elements on this slide is one way is to look into driving these investments in both in renewables and flexible resources. And they can be supported by choosing the most optimal support scheme for renewables. And the answer is really pick the scheme that best suits the goals you finally want to achieve. And also improving access to power purchase agreements, for example, by allowing or stimulating access to participants that currently don't easily get access to such PPAs. On the other hand, there's also right-on tackling of the long-term market liquidity. Some of the suggestions, some of the considerations raised are market making, which is so improving market making. A market maker is an actor that's active in the market and on the buy and the sell side, thereby increasing liquidity. Another element we put forward is looking again at the forward capacity allocation, maybe having a forward capacity allocation that is a bit more optimal and maybe closer to what we currently have, for example, in market coupling. So have a better and more efficient use of our transmission capacities. And then, and that's one with a very big exclamation mark, collateral requirements can also be looked at, but that's definitely not something that just one entity can do. This is really something that needs to be done together with financial authorities, with ESMA, but it's also one of these things that we have seen that have increased dramatically, the collaterals, I mean, and could also be looked into. The next slide, please. So a very important element is getting these investments done. And the most straightforward answer is to triggering such investments, both in flexibility and but also in renewables, is to have a price signal. So the price signal will be the main driving force for all of these elements on the slide. So we're not going to go one by one, but all of these technologies, all of these possible solutions that would offer the needed flexibility in the system, well, they basically need a price signal to trigger these investments. Very importantly in this is the seasonal flexibility. It is already an issue today, but if we are going to shift away from gas, if we are going to have more electrification, for example, heating, so if you have to replace a big chunk of heating in the winter by electricity at some point, well, this seasonal flexibility will become increasingly difficult to address. Not difficult, but just it will be a challenge that has to be taken on board, and that's why this pricing will be so important. The next slide, please. And then, well, this figure is quite emblematic. It's really about, think about these huge projects that are being undertaken. This particular one hints at whatever the big amounts of capacity that we'll have to build in the North Sea. And that's just one example. It will need a lot of, it will need all hands on deck. So there will be a need for tackling non-market barriers. So not just the market is important, also the non-market barriers like fast infrastructure rollout. And this will need coordination between member states. And the message that is in between, to read between the lines and also very explicit on the slide, is that if we want to become independent of third countries, we might want to rely, or we have to rely more on inter-EU member states interdependence, because the one will not go without the other. And then the next slide, please. So the report, as already mentioned before, also delves into the current extreme shock situation. I'm not going to go into separate examples, but just to highlight the general message that whenever a structural interventionistic measure is being considered, it's the threat with caution. All of the benefits that Rafa has been highlighting before, but we don't want them to be destroyed with measures that might, in the medium and long term, then undo them. And undoing them, it might be hard to redo them afterwards. So that's why any interventionistic measure needs to be well considered, and maybe perhaps first looked at the root cause. And in this particular price shock, it's the gas price. And then we also in the report, in the next slide, please, we also are looking further ahead. So possible insurance mechanisms that we could think about if you want to implement in the future. And I do want to stress the future. It's not something you want to just implement quickly during price shock. It's more something you want to be foreseeing and telling the market very clearly about that this will be the way you might want to tackle in the future. And two examples of such insurance mechanisms are given via the temporary relief valve and affordability options. They both have in common that it's not something you do now, it's something you do when it's a bit calmer. And they both have in common that they allow a normal market operation until a certain point, till a certain threshold is achieved. A temporary relief valve is more about when a certain point is reached, then you would limit the prices, but everything would be known in advance and designed in a way to best suit the market's needs. And the affordability option is a regulatory intervention that hedges a predefined group of consumers and also would be implemented in advance. So that's it on my side. I pass on the floor to my colleague for the questions.
Thank you, Patrick and Rafa. We can now start indeed the Q&A for this session. as a question using Slido, so slido.com #marketdesign2022, or by scanning the QR code on the slide. And I see there are a number of questions coming. I would maybe start with a question for you, Rafa, on interconnectivity. The question is the following. What do you think about the relevance of developing at last interconnections between the Iberian Peninsula and France so that Iberian renewables can contribute to mitigate the spike in gas prices?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Francois. Thank you for the question. In principle, it will be difficult to have a solid answer on specific borders, but what is a fact is that there is a value in interconnectivity, and we highlighted it throughout the report. In the specific case of the Iberian Peninsula, for example, in the first preliminary assessment of April, we mentioned that there was among the areas with the lowest level of interconnectivity, possibly explaining to some extent the high level prices by then. But as a general rule, what matters is that whenever there is a chance or a benefit in increasing interconnectivity, there is a case to do so, be it for increasing or for a better penetration of renewables, for efficiency, or for security of supply. I think that the three elements together, if there are benefits behind, and those benefits are higher than the possible costs, I think that there could be a case for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafa. Maybe another question related to the Iberian Peninsula, and maybe I would ask this question to Christian, if you don't mind. What is ACER's view on the recent defined price cap in Portugal and Spain? Is there a dialogue between ACER and the European Commission on this case?
Yes, thanks, Francois. Thanks for the question. To the question, no, we as ACER, we are not part of the discussions on this specific proposal, which has been put forward by Portugal and Spain. It has been portrayed a bit in the media, which we read. So judging from the media alone, it probably comes close to the third type of measure that Patrick was going through in the slide on the spectrum of various measures, which are more or less intervening in the market. It's on page 54 of our report, for those of you who have it in front of you. And here in our report, we put forward some, I would say, general words of caution for policymakers to reflect upon as they balance various priorities that they face. And Patrick alluded to some of them in his walkthrough of the slide. That said, we would refrain from commenting on specific national measures. We think that is not our role, as it were. So that's how I would respond to that question. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. Then I see also, and maybe to move in to a different topic related to bidding zones. So a question for both of you, Rafa and Patrick, maybe starting with you, Rafa. ACER suggests that to make bidding zones smaller to improve locational signals, without mentioning that this worsens liquidity of forward markets. It is also mentioned that liquidity needs to improve. Is ACER aware of this discrepancy? So Rafa, please, and Patrick, if you'd like to complement afterwards.
Yeah, I think that the report as such does not necessarily talk about the smaller or bigger bidding zones. What we try to illustrate with one example is some benefits that are behind the granularity of bidding zones that could be smaller, but what matters with granularity is that the physical congestions are reflected to the maximum extent or to the extent possible. And this potentially in some cases could involve smaller bidding zones. Now, this is not the whole story about bidding zones, and there are, and this is what the regulation says, and this is acknowledged. There is a number of criteria and elements that need to be studied, being liquidity one of the most important ones. But at the same time, we also want to believe that there are tools that potentially can combine both of the best worlds. So like the best of granularity of price signals to potentially through better bidding zones, and elements to enhance price liquidity, which do not necessarily mean that they have to be large or smaller. So I think that that would be how we would see at the issue. Thank you. maybe Patrick, in case.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to add really here, but maybe we should take the next question.
Right.
Okay. Then maybe I would ask you actually two questions, Patrick, which relate to renewables support schemes. We've seen a number of questions coming up. One which is, the first one is, how will more efficient support mechanisms for renewables improve forward market functioning, according to ACER? And then also ask the second question, maybe you would like to answer them together. The second question is the following. PPAs, power purchase agreements, are market-based. What does ACER mean by supporting and improving access to PPAs? Isn't this a rather strong intervention in the market? Patrick, please.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. On the first one, so this is just scratching the surface, of course, but so one way that efficient support schemes could support also the forward market functioning is by having a cascading effect. So several support schemes that would trigger a hedging need, and then as soon as a hedging need, for example, the affordability option is one of them, and you create a hedging need that then someone else will have to hedge forward. So as soon as this dynamic is added to the system, you would create needs on both demand and supply side for hedging. So this would already create some kind of dynamic. So some renewable support scheme would trigger such dynamics, others wouldn't. So it's really about, if this forward market function is really that important, well, nudge towards looking into these support schemes. It's not really about this one solution, but if forward market function is the most important goal you want to achieve, there's certain instruments that are better suited for those needs. It's more that message that we wanted to convey. On the PPA, and that's a very good question indeed, the interventionistic approach might be soon looming. The first idea that was raised in the paper is more facilitating. So the main idea was also more of if we now PPAs may be something, broadly speaking, for bigger players, maybe a pooling of players, whatever way possible, might be a way to enlarge the access to both demand and supply of PPAs. So that's facilitating, doesn't need to be heavily interventionistic. Of course, and this is where I agree with the point raised. The paper also raises the Norwegian example, where there's some kind of guarantee from the state vehicle for PPAs, and this would indeed be a more interventionistic measure. Again, we don't want to imply you have to do this guarantee. It exists. There's instruments that you can get inspiration from in other countries. If that answers the questions.
Thank you, Patrick. I think it does. And I see we're almost running out of time. So I'll ask one more question and see if we have time afterwards for last question. It's a general question about the risks which may hamper investments. Maybe here again, I could ask Christian if you'd like to come in, and then Rafa and Patrick if you'd like to complement. The question is the following. The main challenge for investments is not the missing price signal, but legal and regulatory risks, for example, because of the uncertainty of climate policy. What is ACER's view on this?
Yes, thanks, Francois. Thanks for the question. We will definitely acknowledge that regulatory risk plays a role for the willingness to invest, to the extent that investment is subject to market signals, as I think most want. Whether that's primarily climate policy or other types of interventions, I'm less sure. I think from our perspective, having clarity on the framework, also longer term clarity on the framework available is key, and therefore having, shall we say, an ex ante as opposed to an ex post approach is a good rule of thumb for lowering the perception of regulatory risk, as it were. So it's a bit of a general answer, I recognize. It's also a general question. I would say I think there is a strong case for looking at longer term market functioning, as Rafa and Patrick were outlining, in particular because of some of the changes underway in electricity markets and the technologies which are likely to be increasingly deployed. So that has already been gone through, and of course we dive into this more extensively in the report. That's how I would try to answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Rafa, Patrick, would you like to add anything?
I think we can leave the time for the next session and questions. I think it was
okay. And Patrick? Okay.
Maybe just a general comment is throughout the document, I think several instances we do recognize, implement what's already in regulation. And much of it is about removing hurdles. So this, I think, could be captured under this. So it's already acknowledged, and it's already acknowledged in regulations. So it's about doing it. Doing it.
Thank you both. I see that time is up, so I suggest now we move to the second session for today, and I hand over to Una.
Thank you, Francois.
Go ahead, please.
So for session 2, I introduce my colleague Sheila Bartok, who's a team leader in ACER, and she's going to talk about retail and gas influence and impacts on wholesale electricity. Go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you, Una. Maria, could you turn the slides? So good morning, everyone. I would like to talk first about the gas market situation. And as it was mentioned earlier, uncertainty around the future supplies is a key factor keeping the gas prices high. The current gas prices have resulted more from the anxiety of the market rather than real physical disruptions. And this is what you can read through the picture on the left of the side. To recall, the gas markets were getting tight gradually in the past 10 months. This overview of tightening is visible through 3 phases in the picture. And then what you could read out that there were various factors that were playing in this tightening. Starting with the summer till and through the fall of 2021, which is the first phase, scarce LNG imports and narrow pipeline flows eventually led to the first wave of the price increase. Then from late 2021 through early 2022, higher prices attracted extra LNG, but of course they did not offset the subdued Russian pipeline flows. And then the situation further aggravated by February 2022, when the Russian war started in Ukraine, and the price surge further increased. The price surge further increased, and this was due to the aggravated market anxiety, which was considering potential supply disruptions. Several measures and options are being contemplated to get to some corrective measures on the way forward. One of which is demand cuts in the view of the high price signals. This is already happening, and the 9% decrease has been occurring already in the Union. There are also some other ideas that are discussed in the political arena. This is about common gas purchases in order to find a way to fill practically the missing volumes from the overall gas portfolio. This would trigger probably discussions with main gas suppliers. And of course, there are also more interventionist measures that are attracting and increasing attention, one of which is the wholesale gas price cap, which has been discussed in various corners of the EU. Next slide, please. We can also acknowledge that gas prices have driven the electricity prices, and gas prices were the root cause in the escalation of the power prices. This is depicted in the figure on the left again. And the figure traces the evolution of average power prices in Germany, and it shows how strongly power prices were connected with the rising gas prices. And since gas-fired power generation or act as marginal price setters, eventually the correlation is very strong. It's also visible on the figure that the emission allowances were contributors to the increase, however, to a lower magnitude than the increase in gas prices. Facing today's reality, definitely for the midterm, we may need to look into the prospects and drivers of gas price formation. And then there are several factors that put pressure on the EU gas prices compared to the previously experienced normal, let's say, normal economic years that this sector has seen. In this context, probably there are some elements that policymakers could consider, and those are also discussed widely, one of which is to shift away from the Russian gas, to engage more with the global LNG market, to find ways to promote renewables and increase the growth of the electricity. And in terms of gas demand reduction, energy efficiency and further system electrification should be considered. But there may be also questions that may come about market design and policies, and then maybe in the midterm, there might be an influence and maybe a rebalancing between how hub-based and long-term bilateral procurement is being done. And there will be an intensive and ongoing discussion on the storage use and its role. The next slide, please. We also drew a couple of lessons about consumer protection and retail market. Here, what is important that the high energy prices have an important impact on the energy consumer. And not only on the energy consumers, but the same prices have a strong impact on energy suppliers, and some of them were going bankrupt. In most cases, the consumers were transferred to a last resort supplier, and the bankruptcies of the suppliers raise very important debates about how responsible suppliers are in these markets. We looked to potential measures that we could consider in terms of implementation to reduce high price volatility, but at the same time to think about what would be the various roles that the suppliers could play. And as you can see, the scale tries to discuss these objectives, at the same time also tries to show the complexity of these factors. And so on the one hand, an extreme consumer protection could increase the costs that overall the community will pay. At the same time, also you can see that strong prudential measures would put limitation on suppliers and will increase barriers for new entrants. And then thirdly, if we undermine supplier confidence, we will at the same time reduce competition of suppliers in the market. Next slide, please. So there is a question then how we could protect consumer, and then what kind of tariffication we should be seeking. That was a big debate, especially starting late December last year. Consumer protection and tariffing depends on market fundamental on the one hand, but also it's very much connected to the motivation of the relevant players in the market. And there we have to recognize that the consumers and suppliers have very different kind of preferences. On the one hand, consumers may have preferences for a fixed price because that creates some stability. It's easier to follow through the prices. At the same time, consumers maybe acknowledge a bit less that prices vary on the wholesale markets. So then it means that at any event, price increases will be built into the prices. On the contrary, suppliers have a different kind of, and these ones you can see in the picture. So the consumer preference is the yellow line, following which the supplier preference is the green graphic. And so there the suppliers would have a contrary, a very much favoring dynamic contracts, because that follows very much the wholesale price movements. And of course, this kind of option can be also interesting for very informed consumers, and we have a few of those. But of course, it can have very negative consequences for those consumers who cannot follow so closely on the wholesale market. So it means that probably this cannot be a perfect model for all consumers. So the enhancement could be to look at the blue line, which depicts the fixed flexible tariff model. And that would be about allowing the supplier to have more responsibility on the one hand, but also more flexibility, and also for the consumer to have periods of fixed prices, but a little bit follow more dynamically the changes in the wholesale market. Thank you very much. I reached the end of the presentation. Una, I would like to give back the floor to you.
Una, we cannot hear you now.
Thank you, Sheila. We have a number of questions coming in. I'm going to kick off with the first one, and maybe I'll call Christian in to address this one, which is, to what degree is speculation on the markets a cause of price volatility? Christian, are you there?
I am, yes. Thanks, Una. Yes, I can have a go. So I note that the question refers to speculation in the market and not manipulation in the market, which is a key distinction also for, shall we say, legal enforcement type reasons. So it's difficult to speculate about the degree of speculation, I was about to say. In normal circumstances, I think it's safe to say that when there is very significant volatility and also short-term volatility in certain markets, that increases at times, at least, some entry of those who have a shorter term perspective, and that is sometimes referred to as speculation. So it would seem natural that there was a significant, shall we say, short term positioning and repositioning in the market, which I guess could be referred to as short term speculation, without that, of course, in any way necessarily being manipulation. It's our impression from speaking to various market participants that there is, a very significant degree of volatility in the current market, and many market participants have a very high degree lack of clarity as to the nearer term outlook and perspective, and that has an impact, obviously, on pricing and also on trading behavior. We do make a point briefly in the introductory parts of our report that strictly from the point of view of market functioning, having somewhat greater clarity on what is the outlook for the rest of the year would probably have significant price dampening effect. But of course, we recognize fully that that clarity is difficult to provide, and there are also a number of important political discussions which need to take place to provide greater clarity on the near-term outlook. That's how I would try to answer that, Una, and I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Christian. We've got a number of popular questions here. One is to what extent has the reformation of the EU ETS and the introduction of MSR influenced the dependency for gas in Europe? ETS, Sheila?
I would come from the gas angle more than, and then I'm happy if Patrick and Rafa would complement on the electricity end. But what we have seen, the ETS was following eventually the climate policy aims that the European Union was putting forward, and so therefore we had some increases. But definitely we have to look at the root cause of the price increase, which was coming from the gas markets, and so the tightening of those markets were leading very much the price increase.
Thank you, Sheila. I have another one on contracts, dynamic contracts. Would you agree that a fully dynamic contract will always, also outside of the crisis, be most interesting for a subset of consumers, so those with dispatchable flexible loads?
We were discussing this, the role of the dynamic contracts and for whom this could be interesting. And we believe that dynamic contracts will come more forward. I think the situation currently due to the price increases makes everybody prudent. But definitely, since in our market design review, we took a longer perspective, we see an important role for dynamic contracts, and informed consumers can navigate those contracts. Of course, this also raises some other questions, which is on the supplier end, and I think we should not shy away from those, because suppliers would need to play a more responsible role in terms of providing information about the market and eventually bring along more consumers closer to the dynamic contract world. And also the way these contracts are being offered would also have to sort of penetrate the various regions of the European Union. So there is a lot to do.
Thank you, Sheila. And just digging a little bit deeper on that, how exactly does the fixed but variable price work in terms of contracts?
So on that one, that was also an interesting discussion. But I think this is to also to be a little bit explored. I think one of the main points is in the fixed but variable one is that you would have periods of time, although you will have an increased a level of price, you could still have for that period a relatively stable price. This, of course, does not mean that the contract is not time dependent. So that would a little bit help to bring closer the fixed flexible to the realities of the market, and that would be very important also as we are going to have more renewables in the mix. So following a little bit how the prices are moving would be interesting. Definitely here as well, the information would play a key role. So the supplier responsibility stays. Also
Okay,
for certain, yeah, I think I can stop here. Sorry.
Yeah, Francois, would you like to jump in a little bit on that one, on the fixed and variable? I see a number of questions coming in. Is it a fixed time of use type price, or what exactly is it?
Maybe to give some potential practical considerations, and if Maria, we could come back to the slide which depicts this. So if you could go back one slide, I think. Thank you. So the idea is really to strike a balance between, on the one hand, a power system which will need the flexibility and therefore will have price signals which evolve over time, and then consumers who would like to have some predictability in their tariff. And as mentioned by Sheila, still this is a kind of open debate, and the implementation may well depend on local considerations and national context. Some practical elements could be, so looking at the blue curve, which is the fixed but flexible tariff, one could envision that, say, in the morning in summer, so between 6 and 8 hours, the price would always be 40 cents per kilowatt hour. But it would be much lower during the night. And there in summer, consumers may have an incentive to move some of the demand to the night or to the middle of the day if you have a lot of solar power. And this kind of tariff between 6 and 8 in the morning would be fixed for a certain duration, giving predictability to consumers. So they, for example, they know if they would like to invest in a better appliance, which provides this flexibility. Another consideration could relate to then changing this structure for winter. So you'd have a different blue curve when you go to winter. One could also consider that maybe you could have a few days per year which you would deem where the system is under stress, and therefore tariffs would be higher, and consumers would have an incentive to really reduce consumption during those days, as was the case, for example, on certain French consumption tariff in the past. And then this predictability may also translate into a need for suppliers to hedge, because if this tariff is known in advance, say for a few months or years ahead, suppliers may have an incentive to hedge on the forward market. Still not, well, following a different pattern as, for example, for the yellow curve, where really the tariff is fixed and we wouldn't really harness the flexibility of demand. So I hope that helps. And I hand back to you, Una.
Thank you, Francois. Sheila, just moving on to a slightly different subject, supplier bankruptcies. We've seen quite a few bankruptcies. If the concern is that electricity retailers might go bankrupt when prices spike, wouldn't the answer simply be to impose stress tests or contract coverage ratios on retailers, as we do for banks, thus reducing the risk of bankruptcies?
We have not necessarily considered this element, but it's a very interesting proposition. I think what what we had in the discussions to sort of increase supplier responsibility and to have a kind of closer monitoring on how the suppliers are doing. Some of these elements have been considered, for example, in the United Kingdom. So it's important to a little bit test how the suppliers are doing. So there, I'm aligned with the proposition. Coverage ratios, I think, say, you know, maybe it's a discussion for the regimes that are being under more stressful or less stressful situation. I think that is something that should be considered in a stakeholder discussion.
We're running out of time. There is one very popular question. I might ask Christian to come in very quickly on it, which is about gas price caps. Christian, are you there? As ACER calls on integrated markets and their functioning, how does ACER evaluate the measures of an EU-wide cap on gas prices and its consequences for gas and electricity? Quick answer, if you could, Christian.
Yeah, okay. My quick answer is it's a difficult question to answer, not to dodge it, but rather it's difficult to assess the risks. One immediate risk which comes to mind is if you cap something below the cost, how sure are you that it will come? And we saw earlier on in the presentation, and we dive into it in the report, that actually the high prices, whilst of course significant and detrimental to some activity in their own right, did manage to attract flexible LNG cargoes. So if a cap is set, how certain is one that one can attract the gas, as opposed to perhaps even exacerbate a supply shortage? So it's difficult to assess the risks of that. I think it's also difficult to put into practice. There may be a distinction between, shall we say, pipeline gas and LNG gas for various reasons, etc. I would say something definitely worth proceeding prudently and cautiously towards, because there are significant risks in such an approach, in our view.
Thank you, Christian. We'll say farewell and leave you to continue on with session, the last concluding session. Thank you, Gina.
Yes. Thank you, Chula. Thank you, Una. Yes, indeed, we have a third and final session ahead of us. This is a session which I will moderate and will have two presenters. This is a bit of a concluding session. So in a second, François Baud, whom you have heard earlier in the webinar, will try to give an overview of the 13 measures that we put forward for policymakers' considerations, trying to group them in a number of different categories. And then after that, we'll immediately turn to Katerina Sikov-Magni, who is a director at DG&R in the European Commission, for some very initial reactions to the report on the part of the European Commission. And then we will have a bit of time, I hope, for Q&A, just like we have had up until now. So for that, François, I turn to you for this overview of the 13 measures that we put forward. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. If we can go to the next slide, please. What I will do as a conclusion is to try to summarize what we've discussed in more details over the previous two sessions, and to highlight a few avenues where we see maybe consideration may be warranted in order to future-proof the system. I will first start with three avenues really focusing on wholesale electricity market design. The first avenue relates to short-term markets, and it covers measure number 1. As Rafa mentioned in session 1, analysis carried out shows that short-term markets have brought a number of benefits to European consumers. They also increase the resilience of the European system to some stress, for example, related to generation outages. At the same time, and we saw it a bit already during the Q&A of this session, there is a question about interconnectivity. And beyond the question of building interconnection, we see a number of measures that have already been agreed, for example, as part of the clean energy package, namely, say, the minimum 70% target for cross-border capacity, which could also increase cross-zonal capacity and bring further benefits to European consumers. So we believe member states should carefully consider implementing what has been already agreed as part of existing legislation so that we further deliver benefits to European consumers. The next two avenues relate to future-proofing the wholesale electricity market, and they relate to forward markets on the one hand and to flexibility on the other hand. Regarding forward markets, that covers measures 2 to 6. Patrick mentioned a number of options to enhance access to hedging for a variety of products, not only locally, but also integrating forward markets so that market participants have access to effective hedging, which would then reduce the cost of capital and overall the cost of the energy transition. Here there are a number of options. I won't enter into each and every of them, but they would all probably deserve careful and prudent consideration before deciding what and how to implement. Then the other avenue, which covers measure 7, relates to flexibility. As Patrick mentioned earlier on, we will need flexible resources to complement intermittent renewable energy sources. In this respect, we also need this flexibility to be delivered where and when needed. So people consume electricities, not necessarily at times where intermittent renewable generation occurs. Here we see a potential risk, especially if some were to consider different market designs, different pricing schemes, that those alternative pricing schemes may alter the price signals for flexibility and therefore may make it more difficult for those technologies to come in and provide the service that the wholesale electricity system will require. Moving on now to retail, one avenue relates to consumer protection and suppliers, and it covers measures 8 and 9. As Sheila mentioned, it is crucial definitely to protect customers who are vulnerable from sustained high energy prices. So we will need to do that. At the same time, there is a delicate balance between protecting customers, ensuring the reliability of suppliers, and on the other hand, limiting barriers to market entry, because we would need innovative suppliers to unlock demand response that the electricity system will need going forward. This balance is likely to depend on local considerations, so it's unlikely that we would find, say, a harmonized European balance, but rather maybe national balance may be investigated on this topic. Then I have two more avenues left. The first relates to coordination, and it is rather general, so it covers a number of markets. As Patrick mentioned earlier on, we will need coordination, for example, to accelerate the rollout of renewables or to set up flexible resources in the right location for the right amount, but also to build the network that will be needed to connect all those elements together. And in this respect, coordination between member states may bring significant benefits, also possibly being a prerequisite, as Patrick already mentioned, to become more energy independent from third countries, especially specific. Finally, one last avenue relates to energy price shocks, the current one and possibly future price shocks which may happen. And that covers measures 11 to 13. The first consideration, and that relates to the spectrum of emergency measure that Patrick highlighted previously, is that one should be careful setting up structural measures at times of emergency crisis. So consideration should be prudent about those emergency measures to ensure that maybe first they are phased out when the emergency stops, but also to limit their long-term, especially negative consequences, because then the cost of the emergency measure may actually be higher than its short-term benefits. If one were to want to protect itself against future energy price shocks, the report mentions two measures that were introduced by Patrick earlier on. Those measures are more to protect against future crises than to solve today's crisis, because usually it is better, say, to consider insurance during peacetime than during maybe invasion times, where the cost of insurance may be very high and the willingness of people to provide insurance may be low. With that, I hand back to you, Christian.
Yes, my job here is easy because I will immediately hand over to Katarina. Thank you, Francois. It's probably safe to say that your intervention, Katarina, is one of the more expected ones, I suppose, and there are probably limits as to how much you can disclose given its early days, I would expect. But I will pass you the floor, Katarina. Thank you very much for joining us today. And if you can mention some of the initial reactions that you have on behalf of DGNR, we would appreciate that. Over to you.
Many thanks, Christian, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to be here today with you to basically celebrate the report that ACER has tabled at the end of last month. So energy is an essential commodity for households and industry today. But the high and volatile prices that we've seen in the past months require a clear policy response because they are unsustainably high and volatile. Commission has already taken decisive action. First, the toolbox that was presented last October, and which is still very, very valid. Second, early March, we tabled the Repower EU communication that outlined a series of additional measures. And then third, which is still to come, on 18th of May, we are planning to present a major package on how to implement the Repower EU strategy. And this is also in the context where the ACER's work comes into play. So in line with our request to ACER, ACER has been looking at the longer term market design and how fit it is for the purpose, how fit it is for the increasing amount of renewables that are coming into the system, but of course also taking into account what we have learned from the crisis. So ACER's assessment will feed into our thinking of the longer term market design and how to make it future proof in the years to come. So first, I would like to underline that we welcome ACER's report and we appreciate it enormously. We are very grateful for the work that has been done by ACER and the contribution that member states' national regulators have brought into the work in the past months. So first, congratulations to you, Christian and Francois, and to the whole team for this achievement. We will now, of course, analyze the report in great detail and see what elements of it we will take forward in this Repower package that I mentioned. So here, just some sort of very preliminary reactions, very preliminary thoughts, which I, of course, reserve the right to change when we have done the more detailed analysis. But first, I think what goes without saying is that the importance of implementation of the clean energy package as soon as possible, accelerated, is a no regret measure that we must see, and I call upon member states and regulators to work on this. Then if we look at the recommendations that come to the longer term or even the immediate term, I think it is also, we fully agree that it is important to make sure that these measures support the objectives of the Green Deal, don't jeopardize the decarbonization aim, and that we build on the many advantages of the internal market and keep in mind the drawbacks and don't make then short-term measures that bring long-term problems. So just some reflections here on some of the individual elements that ACER recommended. So what we need to look at is, of course, consumers, business, and investments. How do we make these three elements right? So I'm going to ask perhaps more questions than provide you with answers. And I have highlighted sort of three areas along these lines I just mentioned. So how do we ensure that everyone, including the most vulnerable citizens, can have access to electricity at affordable prices so that they can take part in today's society, which relies on electricity for almost everything we do? how can we then better protect consumers, and here it's all households, but also businesses, against too high prices and too excessive volatility? Because of course we need the price signal and we need some volatility, but when it becomes excessive. And the questions here that ACER report has touched upon, or the answers here that you have touched upon, relate to hedging tools, long-term contracts, maybe an affordability instruments, how to build these into the market design for the benefit of society at large. Then second, how do we ensure investments in renewable and low carbon production that can back up volatile renewables in situation where there is not enough solar and wind in the system, and when price peaks are very rare and perhaps even unpredictable for people to make their business case. Also, flexibility has been around the corner for some time now. We speak about it all the time and we acknowledge its full potential, but I don't think we have it yet there. So what incentives do we need to bring to the market so that we can finally tap on the full potential of flexibility tools, be it demand response, be it more storage, so that peaks can be reduced and the system costs with that. So what kind of support schemes, PPAs, contract for difference, or new type of capacity mechanisms would address these questions of adequacy when there is no wind and solar, and flexibility for the system short term, but also medium and long term. And then the last type of questions is how can we improve the overall efficiency of the system? How to encourage that production decisions, including the emerging hydrogen economy, hydrogen market, that these locate where the resources are abundant, including grid connections and grid resources. So I heard bidding zone mentioned earlier today. Is it the bidding zone review that we need to go for as the next step, or should the EU start reflecting upon a more profound review and look into more efficient locational signals in the overall system? So these are as the initial questions where ACER report provides, of course, many insights and many recommendations and replies, but these are the type of questions that we will want to discuss then with all the stakeholders in the months to come after we have tabled the Repower EU package, which is scheduled for the 18th of May. So that's all I wanted to say as the introductory reaction to ACER's excellent report, and I look forward to the discussion in this session now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina. Much appreciated. Also, your words of thanks to the team. That means a lot to them. I appreciate that. So we have a number of questions, not surprisingly, in this session. Some are directly posed to ACER. I think we'll have a go at some of them. Maybe I would invite you, Katarina, at any time you want to come in and add if you deem it valuable or appropriate. So not relying on me sort of to pass the floor to you, if you're okay with that. So let's see, we'll maybe take the first one, Francois. There's a question about these 13 measures put forward for consideration. Do we as ACER think they will be sufficient to restore global competitiveness of European industry? If not, which additional measures could be taken? Do you want to kick off with that, Francois?
Sure, thank you, Christian. Indeed, that's a good question, a broad question as well. I'll maybe focus on the energy side of this global competitiveness. First, maybe as such, our consideration is not necessarily to say all 13 measures should be implemented. There are measures which may seem no regret, and I think we mentioned a number of times, market integration, maybe increased coordination. Those are likely to bring significant benefits with limited drawbacks, provided there is willingness to take into account cross-border perspective. But then for the other measures, careful assessment is needed in practice with respect to the national and European context. But beyond that, we see that, as Christian mentioned earlier on, this is not the full story. So there are other challenges related, for example, to maybe increased decentralization of some aspects of the power system with respect to consumer side generation, demand side response, and so on, which maybe are not addressed in detail in this report, where additional considerations could be warranted. There are a number of questions related to gas, which have been raised already today. So here further discussions is probably warranted. Our report, as maybe requested also by the European Commission in its initial request, focuses on wholesale electricity. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thanks a lot, Francois. And whilst you're at it, I may actually ask you one other question and then possibly one for Patrick afterwards. Francois, there is a question about ACER's point of view on separating, possibly separating the price formation market at wholesale level, say one for renewables and another one for fossil electricity generators, this decoupling notion, if you will. Would we have a view on that? Over to you, please.
Sure. Maybe on this question, I think there are diverse aspects. Today already, and probably in the future, this aspect will remain. Through renewable support schemes, there is some kind of decoupling between prices paid to renewables and wholesale electricity market prices, for example, to speed up the rollout of renewables. Now, I also understand the question as maybe is it necessary today as an emergency measure to split the market along with, according to technologies, for example, in order to reduce the price paid by consumers. Here, one should be careful when going into that. For example, I remember one question from session 1 about the regulatory risk. Going too strongly, intervening in the market too often may increase the perceived regulatory risk and therefore the cost of capital, which will be a key driver going forward of the cost of the energy transition. So any measure should be cautiously considered. And as Christian mentioned, it may be better in order to ensure predictability of revenues and market functioning to go for ex-ante measures, to introduce measures before crisis rather than during crisis. Of course, separating the market may help reduce the price for customers. They may create a number of issues as to what then should be the price that should be paid to renewables, which is not always obvious, especially if you have hydro dams that can store energy. How do you avoid in this case that those power plants maybe avoid generating now and keep their energy for later when prices would come back to higher levels? There may be questions also related to market integration in this case. What we perceive as a potential big risk would be implementation of non-coordinated national measures that may actually hamper the significant benefits that Rafa described before. So overall, one should be very cautious when considering such measures that tend to split the market. And maybe one final point from my side would also relate to demand response. If we start splitting the market and therefore reducing prices of electricity to consumers, we may actually decrease demand response, which if the EU were unfortunately heading into a situation where electricity and gas were becoming quite scarce, may be very problematic. And I hand back to you, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Francois. There are a number of questions, maybe for Patrick. I don't think we have touched that much upon this issue. It's an issue of the need for collateral, which I would like to see whether you would try to tackle. The question goes, there are concerns of a systemic crisis caused by collateral calls. So calls for putting up collateral so as to support, I guess, price exposure, potentially causing a domino effect on the market with one market participant pulling the next into problems, etc. Would ACER have measures to tackle this? Would you be okay with trying to tackle that one, Patrick?
Yes, it kind of builds upon, I think, what I said before. It's one of these that needed to be treated with care because, of course, these collaterals exist for a good reason. think about the financial crisis a couple of years ago. So it's really about recognizing the two risks. There's a risk that of not having enough collaterals for when, well, a company fails, and there would not be the money to tackle the risk for the others that were doing everything correctly or had the money sufficiently available. And there's also this risk today that there's all these margin calls and all the basically a cash problem that might just not be available, which then puts certain companies into a situation they might not conduct a regular business. So this risk is acknowledged, but it's definitely not one we can tackle not one single entity at a time. This is the discussion to be had with the financial authorities, with the clearing houses, with everyone involved. It's not just, there won't be a quick fix on to addressing this one. It's only suggesting things could be reviewed, and maybe the current high prices could be a trigger for looking into this specific for energy firms, electricity firms.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. I was a bit late to get my camera on. Thanks a lot. We are drawing to a close a bit. Maybe I will have a go at one question, which I think is a bit of a repeat question. And after that, maybe briefly just turn to you, Katarina, if there's anything you want to add, whether it's on the questions or the overall presentation today, which you have already touched upon. But if you want, I pass the floor briefly back to you before I would try to wrap up the webinar so we close on time. At least for now, the final question I think we would have time for. This is a question which touches upon one of these insurance mechanism, quote unquote, measures, which first Patrick touched upon and Francois also summarized in the final session. This is what we have referred to as the temporary relief valve. The question goes that this measure seems to be nothing else than a price cap on electricity market with a predefined trigger. Why does ACER deem it acceptable while considering price caps as one of the worst solutions in general? So maybe what I would offer there, we certainly acknowledge that it's a regulatory intervention into the market and therefore should be considered carefully. We would distinguish between price caps in general, which indeed we find is a quite structural interventionist type measure, because the way we understand this type of mechanism works in other jurisdictions outside the EU, apparently in part of the Australian electricity market and in the ERCOT market, is it actually allows for regular market functioning normally up to a certain threshold defined in advance. So there is an, shall we say, it's an ex ante defined mechanism, hopefully very transparent and clear. It is inspired by, as we understand it, some commodity markets which see a need for this type of relief valve or a pause in price rises in an instance of very significantly high price rises over a short period of time. So there is mostly regular market functioning up to this predefined threshold, where importantly it's a relief valve or a pause for a limited time period. Can obviously be designed more or long, but a limited time period, as it were. So it does take into account regular market functioning. It's an ex ante intervention, and it is a temporary relief and then a resumption to normal market functioning. And therefore, at least at first glance, we consider it a significantly lower interventionist type measure than a broad price cap per se. Obviously, you know, to take this forward, one would need to look more closely at these jurisdictions who have had practice in applying it and seeing how it might be made to fit for an EU context. I'm sure there's not a one-to-one translation, so that would need to be looked at in more detail. That's how I would try to answer that question. And maybe with that, before I seek to wrap up, Katarina, if there's anything you'd like to add here at the tail end, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, very briefly, I think maybe 3 points for following this very good discussion today. So already many thanks to all the speakers and participants there. So I think the first point is that whatever we do, I think we need to keep in mind the decarbonization and Green Deal objectives, because these will bring the solution with energy efficiency, with renewables, with alternative ways of getting gas to the market. We will address the high prices and the volatility thereof. And that should be our guiding principle, keep on track on the Green Deal. Then second, I think the 3 pillars of the energy and climate policy of the EU is still very valid. So we need to have a balance between affordability, sustainability, and security of supply. Maybe too much focus has been on sustainability, but we need to bring the question of affordability and secure supply into the equation and see what is the right balance there. And then lastly, coming back to your report, I think what is very important now in the next step is to look at also the timing of the measures that you have put forward. So which of these measures can be implemented almost, I would say, immediately, whereas which of the measures on the then would require much more analysis, much more thinking before they can be proposed to amend the market design. And here, of course, there are the question of two-way contract for difference, which probably is a very short-term measure to implement against providing locational signals on the grid, which probably requires much more work. So I think this is the next step then to take your measures and look at what can be implemented today and what requires further work. Many thanks. Back to you, Christian.
Yes, thanks a lot, Katarina, for that concise wrap up. Some interesting weeks ahead for you, I imagine. We have a few minutes left. I would like to use them. Maybe we can, well, Maria, we can move to the final slide, which is a bit of a thank you slide. I want to thank the many participants in the webinar for listening to us and also for posing many questions. We didn't have time to tackle the lion's share of them. Hopefully, the ones that we put forward were seen as valuable, what we could address. As I mentioned initially, we will make a link available early next week on our website to a recording of this webinar. We'll do the same for the slides that were used, make that available early next week. And here towards the end, I would like just to take a few seconds to thank the entire project team who has worked quite hard at late and odd hours on delivering this report and interacting with not least our national regulatory authority colleagues on many occasions, but also external stakeholders. So on screen today, you saw Francois, Una, Rafa, Patrick, and Chilla. Thank you also for today's presentation and for your work. Those that you did not see on screen today are Joaquin, Seamus, Ula, Nina, and Emilia, who have also labored very hard for this. Very proud of the effort. Thank you very much for all what you have done. And we look forward to engaging in the coming weeks and months on taking some of these measures forward to the extent our input is needed. So thank you for participating, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.